And in this book, I really got interested in awe scientifically, and also culturally and historically, and started to put together the stories of awe that are the book Awe. And I'd like to tell you 4 stories about awe that are in this book in different ways, that speak to kind of the mysteries of this emotion, what we don't understand, and what I find marvelous about it. The first is the deep evolution of awe. Jane Goodall, when she spent her time observing chimpanzees, as you know, a brilliant figure, a hero of mine. And she observed chimpanzees showing awe, which is interesting at the outset when you think that we sort of intuitively associate awe with religion and music and higher forms of art, et cetera. And her observation was that chimpanzees, when they see large waterfalls and big winds and ravines and thunder, they show what she called a waterfall display. And if you watch the video, it has a lot of the elements of awe, of absorption, reflection, kind of moving and swaying, looking up. And then what really intrigued her, which is piloerection, which is just a fancy term for the fluffing up of the fur. And that actually is a fascinating response, and it speaks to the deep evolutionary history of awe. The piloerection are these little muscles that surround hair follicles, and it's your chills. So who's had just a spontaneous experience of chills that kind of overwhelmed you? What happened?
I felt speechless.
What was the context in which that happened?
Something surprising.
Yeah. Any other volunteers, like a moment of chills, like, wow, I'm just vibrating with these tingles?
Music.
Yeah, you know, fascinating, right? That you can hear patterns of sound waves that hit your eardrum, and suddenly you're fluffing up your no longer visible fur, hopefully. Or for some people, it's visible, and it gives you this overwhelming sense of meaning. And so what's fascinating as we think about this evolutionary history, and very often to understand evolution, we go to non-linguistic physiological systems. The chills is this response, and there's been a lot of work on it that I profile, that non-human social mammals like primates, rats, and dogs and the like will fluff up their fur, and they are merging with other, what we call conspecifics, or members of their tribe, when facing peril together. When facing vast, mysterious things, social mammals fluff up their fur, lean in, huddle, make physical contact, and then figure out the mystery in front of them, right? So when we feel chills at the music today, what's striking about that experience is not only is it triggered by music, which we'll talk about, but it gives you this deep sense of collective identity. This is me, this is my identity, this is my culture, my tribe. In music, primates, social mammals, rats, and dogs feel that and show that patterning of merging with others to become evolutionarily strong. Awe has deep parallels, leading Jane Goodall to say, deep parallels in our primate relatives, that, isn't it amazing that our primate relatives have awe, the beginnings of spirituality, and really what that is being amazed at things outside of the self. That in our human evolution, we start to evolve these physiological structures and emotions that help us move away from self to merge into social collectives, which I think, as a lot of people believe today, is the defining strength of humans in our evolution. The cultural history of awe is astounding, and you could write an entire book on this. Various scholars have gotten close. And it really begins with the indigenous traditions. My collaborator, Dr. Yuri Salidwin here, has written about this. And it's a fascinating history of this emotion of awe, and it's kind of how we feel when we encounter vast mysteries. If you consult indigenous traditions around the world, 470 million people today who are indigenous, 500 million, deep roots, and you read the various accounts, it's just part of the fabric of their culture, right? And there are studies of awe and ecstatic states in the design of baskets and the iconography and then transcendent experiences with plant medicines and dance, right? Big in Native American societies. Food, fasting, it's a heat, right? Very broad sort of representation of awe in the social lives of many indigenous peoples. What happens in the West, with respect to the written word, is awe narrows and becomes a very religious emotion. And that's why today a lot of people feel awe is religious, when in fact, as we will see, it is not. And I'll talk about that, one of our discoveries. Many of the early great accounts of awe and the sublime are religious experiences, because those were the people writing in the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and then after. Julian of Norwich, one of the first books written by a woman is her ecstasy and awe in her love of Jesus, right? And it's one of the most influential writings of awe, and it's all about the ecstasy and awe of being in relation to the divine. In Hinduism, you look at the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, many accounts of just feeling awe at sort of an encounter with the soul. St. Paul on the road to Damascus is a story of awe and transcendence. Awe becomes a religious emotion, and we see the legacy of that. And then a couple of really fascinating twists with deep British roots. The Age of Enlightenment transforms awe, right? The 18th century. And if you are interested in the sublime, you really should read Edmund Burke, a radical, fascinating Irish philosopher. I think at the age of 27, his first book is differentiating the beauty from the sublime. Later, and we have data on this, the beauty is kind of softer and warmer and more affectionate and understanding. Awe has mystery and power and the like. And Burke comes along and says awe is about power and obscurity, and that's why I translate it today to vastness and mystery, or not being able to make sense of it with your current knowledge. And what Burke does, in keeping with the Age of Enlightenment, is he secularizes awe, right? It's a radical book, and he's like, you can feel awe for patterns of light and sounds in the streets. The ox is a great source of awe, but not that beautiful cow, and he makes this interesting argument. He doesn't believe you can feel awe through the scent, which may have to do with the kinds of scents that he was exposed to at the time. Because when I told that to a French woman who worked in the fragrance industry, she was like, oh, those British, they're out of touch, you know? But the important point is Burke comes along as a 27-year-old and says, hey, it's not a religious emotion, it's all around us. It's in animals, it's in sensory experience, it's in your ideas, it's in shadows, it's in sunlight. It becomes secular. And then awe becomes the full-blown obsession with romanticism. And you really should read Andrea Wolf's Invention of Nature, a spectacular book about how art and science came together in Alexander von Humboldt and a romanticism of discovery, of just using awe to find out about science and beauty and how art played a role in that, and really turning to nature and music for awe. Those ideas move to Ralph Waldo Emerson, William James, his godson, Margaret Fuller, a very profound figure in American transcendentalism, which was about the sublime and awe in nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom I'll get to. Emerson freaked out in a museum in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where he saw all these skeletons of other species in the 1820s or 30s, and said, we're all part of this big, vast process, somehow uniting our nervous systems. I will be a naturalist. I will find the divine in nature. Extending Edmund Burke to say, awe is just part of the world, right? What we find vast and mysterious. To close out our story, you really have to bring William James into the picture, because, you know, varieties of religious experience, you know, what a hero of American thinking. He takes nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas, has a transcendent experience. He falls, I know, it's kind of comical, like, that's all it took for him. You know, he was a kind of a depressive guy. He didn't need much. He feels like he comes into contact with God, and he gets invited by the Edinburgh lecturers to give a talk on religion, and he interviews a bunch of people, gathers stories about the transcendent experience. And what he does, and again, this is just moving from Burke to Romanticism to now over on the American shores, he says religion is just feeling. It's our feeling in relation to the divine, and you can find that anywhere. It's in every religion, which was important at the time. It's in nitrous oxide, it's in yoga, it's in dance, it's in visions, it's in hallucinations, it is in poetry and literature, and it becomes pluralism. And that's in a way where we are today. We start with indigenous roots of like it's everywhere, it becomes put into a religious emotion and broadens out. Okay, so let me now tell you the third big story, which is really my career, of the science of awe. And I want to just give you some highlights and some mysteries in this. And then hint at things that you may want to ask about later. So, you know, it's fascinating to me, and it's a challenge for a scientist because, you know, when you ask people about awe, they say it's immeasurable, it's ineffable, you can't actually capture what it is, you can't use words to describe it. William James called them tattered fragments when he tried to make sense of awe and the transcendent. And I have to note an irony here, which is that although people think it's ineffable, people write about awe all the time. And in fact, it's one of the favorite themes of writing in mysticism and nature and music and psychedelics. You can't help but write. But it did pose this challenge of science. Like, how do we measure awe? You know, and it's kind of comical. Like, you go have a big transcendent experience, and I come along and like, so was that a 7 or an 8? What do you think? You know, you sure it's an 8? Because you look like a 9. You know, do you even know what you're saying? You know, and so we have deployed all kinds of tools to understand awe. And I'll give you a few highlights that are at the core of our understanding of awe. The first is in the spirit of William James, which is we were humbled by, you know, how in the world would you study awe in a laboratory? A 9x12 room with fluorescent lights like that, where you're looking at a screen and it's horrible furniture, and you're supposed to feel awe. And we kind of had disasters. So what we decided to do is what William James did, and we gathered stories of awe from 26 countries around the world. And it's from Mexico to India to Japan to Brazil to Poland to the UK and the like. And it took us 2 years to translate them, code them, put them into categories. They are astounding revelations of this experience. But important for our understanding of awe, vast mysteries, is they tell us about what philosophers call the intentional object of an experience, what your consciousness is focused on. And what I in the book call the 8 wonders. Awe is about the moral beauty of other people. The most common source of awe around the world, other people's kindness and courage. Who's had an example of an experience like that recently? Where you're just struck by kindness, courage, somebody's strength, their resilience. Yeah.
Yeah, just walking down the street today, was in a low moment, and that person kind of caught it, and they kind of empathy, and the kind of connection felt, even just in that quick pass by, eye-to-eye contact was just amazing. I was like, wow. And it really kind of paused me.
Yeah, and that has the structure of an awe experience, like catches you off guard, you know, eye-to-eye contact, kindness there. There's another example of just everyday moral beauty. Kindness, courage, just sort of took you off guard, caught you off guard, yeah.
The other day I was running to get a train that was just about to leave. And the guy who jumped on it before me saw that I was running down the platform to get it, and he threw himself into the closing doors, and they literally slammed on his shoulders, but like managed to force them open so I could get on. And it was very courageous, and he had no reason to do it. So yeah, it was.
But did he ask you out for a date after? Because
No,
that sounds a little suspicious, but, and a little heroic and, you know, excessive, but that good enough. So, yeah, you know, notwithstanding what, you know, Facebook or Meta, whatever they decide to call themselves, you know, makes you believe about the world. There's a lot of moral beauty around, and that was our first wonder. Collective effervescence, moving in unison. Nature, lots of awe nature. Britain has a big walking tradition that dates back to the ascent of Mont Blanc, which I write about. And then culture comes in with really powerful sources of awe in these 8 wonders, which visual design, from paintings to Sagrada Familia, to the design of the, you know, the mechanisms of a watch, music, which I'll talk about, and spirituality. And then 2 intriguing ones, which are big ideas, where people are blown away by a big idea, right? Isn't that interesting? Who's had a big idea that just brought them all? Yeah. Yeah.
Just all the time, if you keep being in the present moment and stop responding how you think you should socially, and you kind of think, wow, that's astonishing what you're saying, and most people probably wouldn't hear it.
Yeah, you know, the role of awe in how we observe our minds is understudied, and it is awesome to like, oh my God, these are kind of thoughts that I have that society constrains. Yeah, you know, it's fascinating. People were freaked out by, you know, Marxism and libertarianism, free markets, big data, chemical processes, you know. So we are drawn to big ideas. And then one that caught us off guard that I'll talk about in just a bit is life and death, that around the world we are astonished by life. And I became convinced that awe is almost like a life detector. It's like this feeling that spring hits and everything starts to bloom in synchrony, and you're like, oh, I'm awestruck. But we're really struck by the emergence of life, of our own species and others, and then passing away, which I'll talk about later. This is a younger audience. When I teach older audiences about awe and ask them to tell stories of awe, if you're 60 or older, a lot of people are awestruck by the passage of life. And watching people go, thinking about what that means, what do you think about the metaphysics of it? It is one of the big mysteries. So first big finding is there are these 8 wonders that bring us awe. The second very interesting finding is, and we got this from just asking people to report on their awe experiences every night for a couple of weeks, is it's much more common than you might imagine. People feel awe 2 to 3 times a week. Just like your nice example. Like, oh, I was on the tube and I shared a piece of chocolate with this neighbor and we told stories about our childhood, whatever it is. I was like, wow, it was humanity, right? People in different parts of the world are finding it pretty easily. And that tells us, when you think about the health benefits I started with, that this is good news for healthcare and our own well-being. Happy to talk about that, right? Just cultivating awe. The third story of awe is how it and why Laura and I, my editor, used the word, I forgot what the British title is, it's the transformative power. Awe transforms you. It is astonishing how radically awe transforms you. So I'll give you a few examples. A lot of our life is spent thinking about the self and status and goals and striving and money and reputation and how I'm navigating the world. That's important to navigating the world. Awe shuts down the self and opens your mind up to connectivity. So much so, there are chunks of your brain called the default mode network, prefrontal cortex, over here to the side. Psychedelics tends to shut them down. Awe shuts that part of your brain down. It just quiets down the self-focused representational processes in your brain. And suddenly people are like, when they feel awe, you know, I I feel quiet. I feel humble. I'm not aware of myself. I don't feel pain, right? Awe is moving your attention away from what I consider one of the real problems of the 21st century, self-focus. Awe has radical effects on your physiology. The tears of awe, the chills of awe. It activates the vagus nerve, which is this big bundle of nerves that I study in the lab, largest bundle of nerves in your mammalian nervous system. It starts from the top of your spinal cord, goes down to your gut, slows your heart, slows your breathing, helps you vocalize, orients your head to make eye contact. It opens you up to other people, right? Awe is quickly shifting your body out of narrow fight or flight focus to, I'm curious about the world. And then one that got a lot of attention from our lab is awe reduces inflammation. Inflammation is your immune system's heating up of the body to attack pathogens. It's great in the short term. In the long term, it's very dangerous to have heightened inflammation. The 1 million people who died of COVID in the United States, most had inflammation pre-existing, right? They're stressed. For various physiological reasons, your immune system's on overdrive. Awe quiets that system down. So it really opens us up to the world, which is fascinating. And then the awe produces a lot of prosociality and a sense of I'm part of a community. So much so, you can listen to music and you can listen to a symphony that has no semantic associations with people, really, and you come out of there and you're with a bunch of strangers, and suddenly you feel like, I'm feeling awe and tearing up, and I love these people around me there. These are my brothers, let's go camping, you know, whatever. And you just feel common humanity. You can look at the rocks of Yosemite and be awestruck, and suddenly you feel like I'm connected. And that's good news because of the loneliness epidemic. So that a lot of people are concerned about. So let me just tell you a few scientific highlights. And then each of the chapter takes that science and says, let's look at these 8 wonders, and then talk about a few of the highlights. Simple exposure to stories of moral beauty, right, of kindness. One of the stories is about the Amy Beale family, and Amy Beale was a college student, was killed in South Africa, and her parents built a nonprofit in South Africa to help the kinds of kids who killed their daughter, right? Massive act of forgiveness, and when you hear about it, you're kind of overwhelmed with the capacity for forgiveness and redemption. And just simple exposure to moral beauty stories has this whole suite of effects where you have oxytocin, you get a vagal tone effect. It activates particular parts of your brain that are about moral center, and you no longer see the world in terms of the moral divides of our times, but kind of linked by purpose, right? So you shift in your social perception. I love the new science, second wonder of collective effervescence. Collective effervescence is a term by Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, who felt that one of the sources of spirituality was just moving with people together, starting to, focus your attention on what you're all moving toward, having ideas about that, and then this feeling rushes over you of collective effervescence. You're just bubbling and electric and goose tingly. Who's had a experience of collective effervescence that they would share? Where you're suddenly with a group and you're like, oh my God, I'm just suddenly like, I'm not a single individual, I'm this, this superorganism, I'm feeling transcendent. Who's had a recent experience of this?
Not recent,
I know.
but when I used to be part of a football team.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was quite common. You can describe, you're in a state of oneness, and it's not, even before the match starts, so the idea of hanging out together.
And it's kind of weird, isn't it? It's like you're watching a game, it's a game, but nevertheless.
We were playing the game.
Oh, you were playing?
Yeah.
Okay, you're playing the game, and yet you feel this sense of kind of moral unity through collective effervescence. Who's got another experience of yeah?
Sorry, I think I have to wait for this. Oh, thank you. It might sound like a silly example, but I know that doing things in synchronicity releases lots of endorphins, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
I went to a Kaylee, like a big dance where they tell you the dance moves and stuff for Burns Night the other week, and you're in a, like a village hall that doesn't look very exciting, and it's packed full of people who are, 75 and 17, and everyone's holding hands with strangers and all doing exactly the same thing at the same time. Some are experts, some are pretty rubbish at keeping count. But it's just amazing because you just see everyone get the gist of it over a couple of dances, and you're all doing the same thing. It's really fun. But
Yeah.
you feel kind of a strange form of awe for how you all managed it together, running around in a hall in Hackney or something.
Exactly. And I love your commentary on that. And so, this is one of the most powerful sources and surprising sources of awe is our capacity to synchronize with other people, to start to feel oneness. And then you have these feelings rush over you of awe and bliss and ecstasy where you're suddenly like, this is a transcendent moment. We, in our stories, got stories of people at political marches. You may have had that feeling. Suddenly your fist goes in the air and you're like, this is my people. The musical experience, people feeling music and having the collective synchrony. And there are remarkable studies where, if you share music with other people, your physiology from brain waves to heart rates to cortisol levels starts to sync up. And this boundary between self and other really starts to have reasons to dissolve, right? One of my favorite things to write about, academics often put down sports. They think it's not serious and it's just a game and, et cetera. But they came pouring in, just like yours, in our awe stories of, Brazilian soccer fans and Arsenal fans here in the UK, and just like, being a fan and watching sports as a source of deep meaning and awe. And I love a sociological study in this vein where the sociologist took Durkheim's ideas of collective effervescence and made the argument that rabid sports fans, it fits the Durkheim analysis of religion. And he analyzed Pittsburgh Steelers football fans in the US, and they have these rituals where they cook together, they share food, they have sacred clothes that they wear, don't touch my clothes, They love to get buried with their Pittsburgh Steelers fan clothes. They have sort of these actions of self-abnegation. Pittsburgh Steelers play football games in minus 20 degrees. And when they score a touchdown, a lot of people take off their clothes and, they wave these little terrible towels. And she said, this is kind of a William Jamesian spiritual awe-based religious experience. It's for you to decide. Nature is rich literature with a lot of, power to produce awe. There's making a difference in the world on nature. London is greening. It's one of the greenest cities in the world. In the United States, we have the national parks, which is an idea that started at Berkley, displaced indigenous peoples, and that's a huge trauma. But 360 million people went to the national parks last year, right? We now have a movement to get, in California, every citizen public transport to 10 minutes from a really good park, right? So it's transformative. And it's just incredible. I'm sure you've all, had experiences of awe in nature. They're from Wordsworth to the people who climbed Mont Blanc to, Ralph Waldo Emerson, foundational figure in the environmentalist movement, Rachel Carson, whom I profile in the book, a radical writer, so important in the US history of environmentalism, Silent Spring. That's my editor, by the way. She's handling important stuff. So. Thank you, Lord. But it's amazing. Ralph Waldo Emerson, on a day, he said, they're standing out in the bare woods, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space out in nature. All mean egotism vanishes. There is nothing that nature cannot repair. And there are studies from South Korea and Japan and the US, and we did some, a little shot at nature. The body is almost like wired to receive, literally the sound of water will activate the vagus nerve. Certain kinds of chemicals coming out of flowers hit your olfactory system, phytoncides, and activate kind of a sense of openness, activates dopamine. We are wired in our bodies to take in nature, as the indigenous traditions long ago knew, and we're trying to figure out how to meet the climate crisis so we don't lose that source of awe. And then finally, before I talk about the final story of awe, and I hope you guys are thinking about music. Music, whoever offered the example is astonishing. Let's just take a moment. Let's think about a moment when you heard a song and that song gave you this powerful, or just a sense of awe. Maybe it gave you goosebumps. Maybe you teared up, right? And not only that, but the music and the patterns of sound waves, which are so hard to study scientifically, and the lyrics tells you, this is who I am. This is the point of my life. So I was lucky enough to be in England in 1978, before most of you were born. It was a tough time in England. Margaret Thatcher was running roughshod over the country. Not only was I in England in 1978, my parents put my brother and me in a comprehensive school in Nottingham, or near Nottingham, which is a pretty tough city. We were the only Americans in this Clockwork Orange type school. And it was rough and tough, and it was just the class structure of England was on full display. And when I heard the Sex Pistols play God Save the Queen, I was just that's it. I didn't grow up, I didn't grow up around punk rock. Where I grew up, they didn't know what punk rock was. It was country and western, and David Bowie would have been killed, and et cetera. But I heard that sound, and I was that, I can't explain it, but and I had massive goosebumps, transformed me to this day. Who's had an experience like that where music brought them this sense of awe and transformation and identity? Yeah.
Listening to Michael Nyman is a composer here, and he does a lot of films, and he did the theme song for Rochester. No matter how many times I listen to it, I cry, and I try not to listen to it because I don't want it to lose the power.
Yeah.
But it still has it.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that amazing what it does to our bodies? Another example of music that someone would be? Yes. And there's some musical all right over there, so.
Some bits of the Harry Potter soundtrack. I think the composer who did those movies did a great job, because every time I watch the movies again, I get goosebumps because it's just beautiful.
Yeah, nice. Music is such a fascinating science, and it's a hard science to do. It's very hard to analyze the acoustic patterns that make up music. So it's hard to pinpoint the stimulus, if you will. But the story of awe is really interesting, in how the sublime is represented in music. And one part of the story is certain forms of music, like in Indian ragas and sacred chanting, tend to have the sounds of awe in them, right? So awe is whoa. And that sound makes its way into certain kinds of music and makes us feel awe. It does things to our body that are music, tears, vagus nerve, certain dopamine patterns, where it's just physically, automatically, it makes me open to awe. And then the big one is the synchronization, right? That music synchronizes us and makes us feel a collective sense of who we are. And little babies, when they hear the music of their people, are more likely to cooperate with a stranger than the music that's played or sung by a stranger from a different part of a culture, right? We have a very early sense of rhythm that links up babies to patterns of movement in their subculture. And there are fascinating studies showing The more we resemble cultures, the more folk songs tend to resemble them one another in the acoustics. Music has this transporting quality of giving us our collective identity, which is a big issue that really needs exploration. So many amazing stories of awe in the scientific literature. So I want to end with 5 minutes on a personal story of awe that has to do with the passing of my brother. And it's been very interesting to, my younger brother, who I had a very awe-filled childhood with, let me just, okay. He, very close, 1 year apart, born in Mexico, raised by counterculture parents, grew up in Laurel Canyon in the late 60s, a lot of Joni Mitchell and the Doors and rock and roll and drugs. And we had a childhood of awe, and we were raised kind of in an experimental way. And he got colon cancer, which is a brutal disease, and died. And the two, for those of you who've been close to colon cancer, it's a horror show. There's no other way to describe it. It's just full of bodies becoming emaciated, losing weight, breakthrough pain, etc. And I was heading into this period of grief. I knew he was going to die, and he, on January 26, 4 years ago, took a cocktail, and I got the call to be by his bedside. And I'm an evolutionary scientist and love biology and cells and molecules, and just didn't know what it would be like to observe his passing, and was reassured by the literature on near-death experiences, which is people become peaceful as they approach the end, very often and almost normatively, and then the idea that this is this vast mystery. And so I'll just read one little passage of what happened to me and then tell you where I went. So listening to Rolf's breath, I sensed the vast expanse of 55 years of our brotherhood, roaming Laurel Canyon in the late 60s, spying on rock and roll neighbors, and skateboarding through Volkswagen-lined streets. In our adolescence, walking the wild foothills of the Sierras and playing Little League on the Penn-Renays, me pitching Rolf, a long-haired lefty, on first base, a mischievous light in his eyes saying, "Man, this is fun." As young adults on wild trips to Mexico, dancing in clubs, wandering in the high Sierras, and then in graduate school, buying wedding suits, being each other's best men, becoming teachers and fathers to daughters. I sensed a light radiating from Rolf's face. It pulsated in concentric circles, spreading outward, touching us as we leaned in with slightly bowed heads. The chatter in my mind, clasping words about the stages of colon cancer, new treatments, lymph nodes, and survival rates, faded. I could sense a force around his body pulling him away, and questions in my mind. What is Rolf thinking? What is he feeling? What does it mean for him to die? And a voice in my mind said, I feel awe. I found great reassurance that around the world, when we observe people pass, you very often feel awe. It is this vast mystery. It's the big mystery in some sense. And as the data rolled in from 26 countries, and I saw that, I was like, God, here I am having this experience. And then after, in grief, I entered into what Joan Didion, in her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, I mean, you should read it if you're in the process of watching people pass. Grief is chaotic. It destabilizes you. I hallucinated. I felt his hand. I kept sensing him around in light and wind and the sky and water. And I felt aweless. I was like, oh my God, I'm just like derailed in life. And I'm not finding this thing I love so much. And so what I did is I hope, and I think some of the readers of the book do, is this is a hard time in our culture. The pandemic produced 30% rise in depression and anxiety worldwide. Our kids are too stressed out. people are too stressed out at work, and awe is a good compass. It's a very, inviting sort of personal thing to pursue. And so in that state of grief, and that's in the book, I just went after it, right? And I talked to ministers and indigenous scholars like Uriah about what is spirit like in other cultures. I listened to music I didn't know. I went to all kinds of mountains because I'm just drawn to the mountains. I went to meditation retreats and I did a lot of work in prisons where I just felt moved by the resolve of those people. And what it did, and I think this is the lesson for life, is life's about going after these wonders. I start the quote with Lao Tzu, who says, wonder into wonder, life unfolds. And that's what life is a bunch of mysteries that we go after. And awe is this amazing compass that points you in the direction of making sense or trying to grapple with the big sources of mystery and then finding joy. And I did find that in the process of grief through awe. And I hope if you read this book, you'll do it in your own way, unattached to grief, but just use it as a way to think about what are the big questions you care about and how do you want to find answers. So thank you. So we have, I hope I'm not.
No, go ahead. We have about sort of 10 minutes for Q&A
Okay.
if anyone wants to
Fire
ask
away.
a question.
Thanks so much. I had a question. You used a couple of terms, bliss and ecstasy.
Yeah.
Are they synonymous with awe? Is there a hierarchy of some sort that you've
They're,
come to terms with?
they're not, and they're like in the kinds of traditions that Uriah, my collaborator, studies of transcendent states. There are rich traditions differentiating ecstasy from bliss. Bliss is more about just entire merging with some vaster force, often spiritual. Awe, you still have a sense of like, I am in relation to the divine or to a pattern of music. Bliss is you lose yourself. And so that's different. And the science, I think it's the next frontier of scientific inquiry is joy, bliss, ecstasy, gratitude, a little awe. And then I love the sense of the absurd where they're like, oh my God, I'm looking at my life from up above. I'm ridiculous, and that's a transcendent state too. And how we get there is pretty uncharted territory, but that's one distinction.
If I can cheat and ask two.
Yes.
One is, I just wondered, listening to you tonight, if in your research you found any kinship with compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there is this world of kind of virtuous emotions, moral sentiments, David Hume and Charles Darwin, compassion, awe, gratitude, and they kind of feed off of each other. So sometimes a reaction to suffering, which brings out compassion, you may step back and think, wow, look at the ways in which suffering arises and be awestruck.
Yes.
Very often, awe will lead to a sense of gratitude or reverence, and I feel so grateful for what gives me awe, and I'll consecrate it. So they're always mixing and intermingling.
And I guess have in common this moral elevation.
Yeah, very much getting out of the self and trying to better things.
Yes. And then the other question was about in bipolar.
Yeah.
In the manic phase.
Yeah.
Has your research brought you there?
Yeah, every human experience is on a continuum, and we do know, and it's a great question because the mania, which I know runs in my mom's family, it gets you into these awe states, of everything's amazing and expansive and we don't, that hasn't been documented scientifically, but I think it's pretty intuitive. And we've also studied really awe-prone people who have 10 experiences of awe a day and I wouldn't live with one of these people. You know, they're kind of complicated. And they're like, come on, man, I'm trying to sleep, you know. But you know, they're pretty wild, and they're like, I'm connected to everything, you know. In one study, we showed one of these people the scene from Trainspotting where Ewan McGregor goes into the toilet to get the drugs, and we were like, we thought it would elicit disgust, and our own person's like, I'm connected to that guy too. Look at it, I feel like we're the same people, you know. So yeah, so every experience has its problems, and its upside and its downside, and it's a great suggestion.
We actually have a question from online as well.
How about that?
From Francesca, who has said that it's a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. She says, as is fitting, you mentioned the post-pandemic difficulties that everyone faces. How can brands operate in this all space to invigorate customers' lives? Can brands leverage awe in a positive way? And have you seen any examples of brands that tap into the emotion of awe?
Uh-oh. We're heading into the commodification of all, so, which I worry about. And they're already doing it. And, you know, there are lots of principles. Jonah Berger has done good work on how to make things sticky and spread, and it tends to be awe-inspiring qualities. All those stories of moral beauties in commercials of, you know, a little child hugging the dad who runs into the classroom and they hop into the Chevrolet, you know, whatever it is. And I just saw recently, which really made me worried, the awe spa. I'm like, so I'm worried about it. And there's a lot of work on brands. So, but I would fight back.
I've got that mic already. Are you familiar with the term flow in mountain biking?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in that because
Yeah.
it seems to be so personal and about you and less about your surroundings and environment.
Yeah.
So that kind of seems to me a way I can generate my own awe with
Yeah.
myself. But that feels completely counter to what you're saying about awe.
You are a profound narcissist, but we still love you. So, yeah. Westerners, it's interesting. We find about 8 to 9% of awe experiences for Western European people, it's about themselves, right? Man, here's my Tinder photo, check it out, you know, and but that's okay. And your example's more lofty, which is, you know, I'm so immersed in this task. Isn't it awesome how time flows, or what I can do with my skills, or what the world has me working on? And again, it's back to this question that emerged earlier of like, we do feel a lot of awe in observing our mental states and our experience, and that's interesting, and we should study that. And I thank you for referring to flow. It's another kind of emotion that's transcendent. It's about doing work in an immersive way. Absorption is different from awe. And terrific book. Glad you feel that.
Thank you. Do you think there might be an inverse relationship between human and scientific progress on the one hand and human capacity for awe? If you take just this sort of example, but if you take back in the 19th century, large parts of the world were not accessible to many people. Now everything's accessible via satellite. There's not an square inch of the world that isn't visible. So do you think that's kind of reduced the scope for awe in some ways? And then separately, for people who are lost to capitalism and lost in the corporate world, does your book contain any advice for breaking out of that and rediscovering their capacity for awe?
Yeah, you know, it's back to the brand. You know, I think it's in many ways it's the best and worst times of awe. You know, we don't know historically. That would be a hard argument to justify. You know, I gave you a soft cultural history of it. You know, in many ways, there's so much potential for awe right now. Just the music we can share, and the art we can share, and the texts we can share, and the like. So that's good news. And then the bad news is the pressures of today and the new technologies. And you know, and I joked about it in the book, but no one mentioned a smartphone around the world as a source of awe. And that's actually a serious commentary, because they sure get hyped. You know, Steve Jobs thought this was the most awe-inspiring thing, and I think it's actually countervailing to the experience and digital immersion. So it's this funny paradox of our times of, you know, a young person today can find awe from African music, Sonar Jogarte, and, you know, a hip hop artist from Chicago, and writing of, you know, that doesn't have to go through the, you know, the publishing process and videos and TikTok, and yet at the same time, we have all these forces that are constraining it. So I think it's a mixed story. Capitalism, yeah, I think that, you know, part of what people are resonating with this book is like as a counterpoint to all the structures that came with this big capitalism rise in the last 40 or 50 years of focus on self and gratify desire. And here's an alternative. So, good question.
We've got time for a couple more.
My question is about, like, a lot of the things that you mentioned were about religion or music, that they kind of solidify groups.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what do you think about how awe can be used to bridge groups rather than solidify kind of subcultures or religions, or like a lot of the history of it has been about creating closed but close cultures?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I think one of the primary functions of awe that it achieves really rapidly is it solidifies groups. It synchronizes your behavior, you become empathetic, your physiology lines up. That's hard work to do ordinarily, and awe does it like that. And suddenly you're like, oh, we're part of a collective. And that can lead to us versus them, and, you know, tribalism and worse. And I think it'll be, I suspect there will be, in the world that I'm in of psychological science, there'll be interventions around having, you know, there already are, you know, a lot of the nature immersion groups are about awe. And in fact, one of the big ones in the UK has a whole awe curriculum. And they take people from different class backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and try to build common humanity. There's a movement in California that we're working with of kind of a service movement for teenagers of like, there's awe, you feel awe when you serve at a teenage life, and maybe that will bridge divides that ordinarily just pop up intuitively. We have a paper where if you get people to feel awe, they no longer polarize individuals on ideological issues like police brutality. They'll say, these sides are more reasonable, there's some common ground, right? So I think both are, you know, it can be misused to polarize and divide, but there are also interesting possibilities you're pointing to. So I'm excited about that. Great question.
I have a short question, which I was wondering, through your research, when you were studying people and their experiences of awe, did you find that people who started doing the study had, like, they registered more instances of awe through it? I'm wondering if once you start recognizing it, you're more likely to feel it. Like, can you foster a capacity for awe, or is it slightly innate due to your upbringing and your personality?
Yeah, that's an amazing, we only have one study on that, and I was delighted with the results. As you practice it, the richer it gets, the more you feel it. We had people do an awe walk once a week, and over the study, they just felt more and more awe, right? Even though they knew they were going to do it, they had the instructions. It's different from a lot of the positive experiences, which tend to attenuate. And that tells us this, it's a kind of a mysterious, magical emotion that grows with knowledge and experience. So, and I hope that extends to other realms of awe.
I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to wrap things up there. But we do have a third floor, which has a bar, and if Dacher is willing to go up there and continue the conversation with you all, then you are so welcome to stay, and we would love to have you stay on and continue. So thank you. We also have some books at the back of the room, so please do buy a copy on your way out, and please join me with a huge round of applause for an amazing talk. Thank you.